Okay, so just quickly before the video starts, if you enjoyed this video, please tell me, and also subscribe if you haven't subscribed already for more of these videos. I kind of want to do more of them in the future, and if you like it, then I definitely will. So please just give me an update and tell me how you feel about them, if I've done it well or not, but otherwise let's just get on with the video. Hi, so here we are, another Dark Souls critique and discussion video. So this is me, Tony, and it's just me for this video the day Gary and Stephen aren't here, because it's specifically me that wanted to go into depth with this particular topic. Now, the first thing I want to say is that I love Super Bunnyhop. I'm no way trying to discredit him or anything like that. I just want to give my 2 cents on the topic as a whole. I feel like he kind of missed the mark slightly in the topic of Dark Souls level design. And funnily, we'd planned on doing a video about this just a few weeks before he released that video, so I just want to say we're not copying him at this stage, we're just adding to the discussion, really. Now, given what Super Bunnyhop has said about the level design of Dark Souls 1, he pretty much hit the nail on the head with that. What I want to discuss specifically in this video is why I think that Dark Souls 1 in terms of level design is a fucking masterpiece, and I just think that he didn't quite get just how great it really is. Then, I want to talk about how Dark Souls 2 and 3, they really kind of missed the mark at delivering what I would say is the quintessential Souls experience. A lot of that being attributed to poor level design, and ultimately, something I think that Super Bunnyhop missed, I feel, is the importance of world design. Now, Bloodborne is a strange mix of all these games, and we'll touch on that as well as we'll touch on Demon Souls. Now, don't get me wrong, Dark Souls 1 is a flawed gem. The level design of the post-Arnolondo areas is quite lacking in parts, honestly, with Demon Ruins, Lost Bastille, Tomb of the Giants and Crystal Caves not having this looping level design present in early areas. They don't connect to other parts of the world, and generally they're not particularly fun in all honesty, and as much as I quite like the Duke's Archives, it still doesn't connect to anywhere else in the world. I'd have quite liked it to connect to somewhere in Undead Burg somehow, but that's just me. However, everything before these areas is really quite masterful, so when I'm talking about the world design in Dark Souls 1, I'm referring to mainly everything up to and including Arnolondo. Obviously, after Arnolondo, there is areas that are still good, overall the game is still great, but just in comparison to itself, really. So, on with the meat of the video. The level design of Dark Souls 1 is, in short, almost flawless. The levels twist and turn and loop back in themselves, which give shortcuts to areas within each individual level. However, unlike Dark Souls 2 and 3, these individual levels are also linked to other areas via an interconnected world. For the most part, but I'm sure you knew that already. What you maybe didn't realise is just how fucking important this was to the reason Dark Souls 1 was as great as it was. The interconnected world was a huge part of shaping the experience players had, and it may be the reason, or at least one of, as to why a lot of people felt that Dark Souls 2 kinda missed the mark. Now, just to make a quick point, I really do love Dark Souls 2, and it certainly excels in a bunch of areas that Dark Souls 1 didn't, but I mean, that's a discussion for another time, but we're really just focusing on the level design in this video anyway. So just how did the world design affect the gameplay? Well, in one of the ways was the freedom that was given to players from the start of the game. Firelink Shrine is connected directly to Undead Burg, the Catacombs, New Londo, if you take the lift as a sort of part of Firelink, which I do, but you know what I mean. It's also connected to Valley of the Drakes, and from there you're connected to Blighttown, Darkroot Garden, Darkroot Basin, the Undead Parish via the Garden, and not Undead Burg, the Great Hollow, Ash Lake, and even the Demon Ruins after Quelag. I mean, you can even return to the Undead Asylum right from the beginning of the game. So all this can be done before fighting the Taurus Demon or even the Gargoyles, which gave different experiences for new players and a lot of different ways to tackle the early game for experienced players, which allowed people to play the game, kind of the way they wanted to an extent, and it encouraged exploration. Freedom to make choices in games is, in my opinion, one of the most important aspects of gaming. Now, Dark Souls 2 and 3 scraps this entirely. At the start of the game, Dark Souls 3 gives you pretty much only one way to go, and even Dark Souls 2 gave players 3 ways to go at the start of the game, and then you could tackle the later areas of the game differently, depending on how you wanted to, I suppose. So I would say that this is an entirely regressive aspect of Dark Souls 2 and 3. Now, Bloodborne also suffers from this linearity, sort of, but it's not quite as much as 2 and 3, and we'll get to that when we get to Bloodborne. And Demon Souls is pretty much unique to in and of itself, where it splits into 5 different worlds that you can tackle it whatever way you want, really. But sadly, this is probably down to players getting lost in Dark Souls 1 and not knowing where to go. Once you reach Firelink, and this could pretty much have just been avoided by giving less subtle hints in where the game's first area is supposed to be. The amount of people that I've seen complain about they just stumbled into the graveyard in Firelink Shrine and then gave up from there, like, oh, the game's too fucking hard, man. Like, if they just put like more sort of signage pointing towards where's meant to be the first area, and then it means that you know that if you're exploring around Firelink Shrine and not going to the Undead Burg, you're kind of, it is just more exploration as opposed to actual progression. But you know, there's just one way around that, really. The interconnected world of Dark Souls 1 also added to the overall gameplay experience. The sense of progression, excitement and accomplishment you get from when you defeat a boss is key to the Souls experience. It's all about overcoming impossible odds, and I would argue that the linked world design of Dark Souls 1 added to this as well. I can't speak for everyone, but I know that personally, once I got to the parish and found the elevator back to Firelink, I realised, like, yes, I'm making progress. Getting that link back to the only safe area in the game was in and of itself rewarding. You got a sense of accomplishment with each shortcut back to previous areas. It's essentially saying, look, you've done well, now you don't have to fight through all these enemies anymore. The game rewarded you for exploration and progression, essentially. The feeling you get when you come out of Blighttown after several hours away from Firelink at this point, ever wondering if you'll ever see daylight in the game again, only to discover that you weren't really that far away from safety the whole time, was great. After defeating one of the most draining areas in the game, it links straight back to the safe space. This applies to Darkroot Garden as well. You don't get the same experience from Dark Souls 2 and 3, and I'll explain why later in the video. Now, this linked world design also helps with immersion. Lordran feels like an actual place. It's huge, all the landmarks make sense, you can see the parts of where you have been and where you're meant to go from other parts of the map, and this is all based around the world design. And I mean, we all know in Dark Souls 2 the whole issue with when you're in Earthen Peak and then you go up the lift and then suddenly you're fucking the Iron Keep and you're just like, how does that even work? But yeah, you don't get that with Dark Souls 1. The design of Dark Souls 1 felt a lot less cheap in terms of difficulty as well, and I feel like there is a reason for this that's also based around the world and level design. I think it's fair to say that you don't get the sense that the devs just plonked a bunch of enemies in the map and just said, go, forcing you to fight with less skill and spamming roll, using cheaper tactics. In Dark Souls 1, the enemy placement felt a lot more calculated, like there was set up encounters for you to like defeat essentially, as opposed to just like masses of enemies like there in Dark Souls 2. It was possible to get ganged up on, sure, but it felt like that was more because of your own mistakes, rushing in, not being observant, rather than intentionally supposed to be that way. Now we'll get to specifically the reasons why that happened in Dark Souls 2 when we get to Dark Souls 2. So I don't want to shine the big golden cock of Dark Souls 1 much more, but something I will say is that even given that the game has a connected world, the progression of the game is being designed in such a way that you have to go back to Firelink at various points, you know, you pass through it. The warping is a bit limited as well, so again you need to pass through certain areas to get to other areas because you can't just warp there. Now some people might not like this, but I feel that this was necessary in a way. Not only did it allow for players to actually stumble upon secrets and NPC quests, such as, you know, finding Rhea in Undead Parish, it actively encourages exploration and naturally has the player pass through Firelink as the game progresses, and it puts a lot of emphasis on the necessity of the shortcuts the game has. Not only this, the end portion of the game you can kind of tackle like the last 4 Lord bosses in kind of whatever order you want, which is definitely not the case in Dark Souls 3, and it was somewhat the case in Dark Souls 2, but yeah, we're going to get to that as well. I feel like the poor level design of Dark Souls 2 is actually a knock-on effect of poor world design. Now as a side note, I do want to say that Dark Souls 2 does some pretty well designed areas. However, the poor world design has knock-on effects outside of just the design of the levels. So to start, the game chucks bonfires at you left and right, and this is probably a byproduct of the linear world. As the world is so linear, the levels don't tend to double back on themselves, with a couple of exceptions. This means that where shortcuts would need to be in Dark Souls 1, there's simply another bonfire. As there are no shortcuts in Dark Souls 2, they need to give bonfires, otherwise dying would mean retracing the same steps over and over. Which brings us on to another point. This linearity and abundance of bonfires means that you would think that the game would be easier. But it is just as hard as Dark Souls 1, but like in a different way. With Dark Souls 1 you had limited Estus flasks and you had your level with enemies and the boss to beat. This meant you had to be conservative with your healing as it was pretty limited. And as we have said, the placement of enemies in Dark Souls 1 does feel calculated, or more so at least than Dark Souls 2. If you were observant or just playing good, you could beat the area, have Estus left for the boss, you'd find the shortcut, and then you could breathe a sigh of relief. Now, in Dark Souls 2 it doesn't really play like this, does it? You have an abundance of bonfires and healing items, so in order to keep the game challenging, the game just throws insane amounts of enemies at you sometimes. You get ganked a lot, if not most of the time in Dark Souls 2, and although still challenging, it feels less rewarding as it just leads to a lot of cheap deaths and using cheap tactics. So you don't really get the same sense of progression as you did in Dark Souls 1. I would argue that finding another bonfire is much less satisfying than finding a shortcut. Very few areas link to other previous areas, and even though you can get to the Bastille via two ways, they aren't linked via the map, you just go there from a loading screen. The few areas that do have shortcuts and loops are the strongest levels in the game, and it's clear why. Well designed areas are just fun to play and explore, and it's as simple as that. The starting area, Forest of the Fallen Giants, is probably the best designed level in the game. It plays to the strengths of Dark Souls 1 with like a central main bonfire, and eventually the level loops around to the bonfire to give a shortcut to the boss room. It's great. Something I will say though is I don't understand why there's a bonfire here when this gate could easily have opened and given a shortcut instead. Like, what even? But the Lost Bastille, one of my favourite areas in Dark Souls 2, still suffers from bonfire syndrome. The area is great to explore, has lots of secrets, even has shortcuts. You can tackle the area in two different ways, totally miss out one of the bosses if you want, and then by doing that it locks off the other part of the area. It's just a really great area, but it would seriously have benefited from just having like one bonfire and just more robust shortcuts. And the same philosophy applies to basically every other area in the game. So yeah, there's even more adverse effects to linear world design, which is that it includes the necessity of warping to other bonfires. An example would be that in Dark Souls 2, if you were at the start of the Iron Keep and needed to go to Majula, you'd have to run through 3 whole areas in order to get back there. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, before Anor Londo, unless you're in the depths / start of Blighttown, getting back to Firelink doesn't really take that long anyway. And given the fact that you can level up and upgrade gear at bonfires, you still don't even need to go back there, which doesn't break the flow of gameplay and ruin immersion, which I feel it does in Dark Souls 2. Firelink was nice because whenever you saw it, you knew you were making some kind of progression, it was a safe space, it was a landmark. And yeah, I mean, sure, it's obvious you're making progression in Dark Souls 2, you beat the boss, you get to the next area, but I'm arguing that it is just less satisfying. However, you really just ended up resenting Majula in Dark Souls 2 because of the amount of times you had to go back there. I mean, how many times have we heard fucking better seek seat lest? For whatever reason, I feel like I have less resentment for Firelink in Dark Souls 3, but the same concept still applies. The linear levels needed warping from the get-go, which ultimately took away from the experience. You never felt trapped or lonely or isolated or unsafe all that much in Dark Souls 2 and 3 because you could always just warp back to the safe area at literally any time. I'm not sure why they insisted on not allowing you to level up and upgrade at bonfires. It's just, that is basically what led to most of this shit. Now, Dark Souls 3 isn't nearly as bad as Dark Souls 2 in terms of raw level design. At least half of the levels do have the magic of Dark Souls 1 levels, such as Cathedral of the Deep, where there's like one bonfire and like a million doors and lifts to various other areas near the bonfire, or Erithel, which is that central bonfire at the church, and the level eventually loops around like twice to it, which is pretty cool. Lothric Castle and the Grand Archives are two really well designed areas that both link to each other, although there's a lot of bonfires, but that's a different issue. So thankfully for the most part, they didn't make the same mistakes as Dark Souls 2, in terms of level design. This also fixed the terrible enemy placement problem of Dark Souls 2 for the most part, because, you know, the levels aren't very linear, so, you know, they do feel a little bit more intricately placed, so we could say. It is however arguable that in terms of game progression and world design, Dark Souls 3 is easily the most restrictive, with the world design really only allowing for exploration of the side areas that are just stuck on at the side of the game progress route. The game gives you the choice to do the Cathedral first or Farin Catacombs, but regardless it's not a very robust choice, is it? I mean, it's nothing like the example given for Dark Souls 1. Not only that, the Cathedral doesn't actually lead to any other areas, so it's a case of just warping back and continuing along the one connected path the game has. At the very least, the game does let you do the dancer part of the game early, which is nice, but it's nothing on the level of choice that you had even in Dark Souls 2, which also brings me to another point. After defeating Yorm, the game has to essentially transport you to the dancer's room, because how the fuck would anybody be expected to think you're supposed to go back there after fighting him to progress the game? Especially if you haven't seen any of the trailers. That's as bad as the fucking Rotunda bullshit in Dark Souls 2. When it comes to the quality of optional areas in the game, you could argue that the game maybe has the best ones. Dark Souls 2 didn't really have many truly optional areas. I mean, sure, you could skip a lot of the game by getting a million soul memory, but that's kind of different. Dark Souls 1 and 3 both have the same amount of optional areas, but 3's maybe feel a little bit more fleshed out, but nothing will ever like hit as hard as Ash Lake did. I mean, Painted World of Ariamis is also pretty fucking good, so it's kind of subjective really, but overall at least the optional areas are solid. Easily, the biggest problem I have with Dark Souls 3 is that it simply just feels like one straight path for most of the game. The game also has the same problem as Dark Souls 2 with the instant warping, and hence there's like a lot of bonfires. It's kind of 50-50, with some areas having lots and some being okay. So thankfully it's not as bad with the ganking enemies problem, but sometimes it is an issue and it's just a total pain in the cunt. Another issue with the linear world is that it seems unlikely that you'd ever naturally discover NPC quests without a guide, as the world just isn't connected. You have no incentive to explore previous areas, as you'll never actually return to them via the average playthrough of the game. For instance, who the fuck would ever go back to the Cursed-Rotted Greatwood after helping Cirrus in Irithel, or whatever her name is? Nobody would ever go back to the ruined bridge to get Havel set after Archdragon Peak either. Perhaps the logic behind it is you don't need to make a connected world if you let the player warp to any stage. I was frankly really disappointed when I first reached Firelink Shrine, thinking that it looked like it was connected to the rest of the game, but sadly it isn't. Weirdly, the game gave you the illusion that the world is connected. When you look off the balcony at Lothric to see the world in front of you, it all looks very tightly packed together, but it is totally separate areas that you tackle sequentially. I mean, I suppose it is technically connected, but they don't link back to previous areas. You would have at least have thought that they would have linked that ruined bridge at the start of Undead Settlement, like made it a connected thing, which would have allowed ballsy players to go to Firelink Keep early, but no such thing is like that. They could have made it so you can't go to Farron from the woods, connected Farron to the cathedral in some way, and basically nothing would have changed in like terms of the game progression. Weirdly enough, there's also a shortcut from like the arse end of Firelink Keep that leads back to like Crucifixion Woods, and I'm just like, why the fuck does that even exist? Like, you're never going to use it. It was interesting because when I first discovered that shortcut, I was like, oh okay, so the first part of the game is relatively linear and then it kind of opens up, but that's not actually the case. It's like you have that one shortcut and you'd never ever need to use it. So another YouTuber called GameSoup, shouts out to him, made the argument that not spending time on designing an interconnected world would allow the devs to spend more time on more important things, such as big set pieces or whatever. However, I would argue that the interconnected world is the most important thing that they could probably have done. Okay, so now we can touch briefly on Bloodborne and Demon Souls. Although technically Bloodborne probably has the least amount of freedom in regards of game progression for the mandatory areas, i.e. you have to do Yharnam first, you have to then do Cathedral Ward, the Forest, Bergmouth, blah 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 blah. But you know, with Dark Souls you had a lot more freedom in terms of how you could handle the early and late game. Bloodborne has its own unique slant on the whole thing. Only 7 bosses are 100% needed to finish the game. Although I would argue that the extreme benefits to both Bloodstarved Beast and the Witches of Hemwick make these areas what I'm going to call semi-mandatory, but they still aren't needed. And in addition to them, there are still 8 other bosses that you don't need to do at all. Now, Bloodborne has a lot of optional areas as well, and although I'd say that they are less fleshed out than Dark Souls 1 or 3 overall, given that there are so many, it would also mean that chances are a lot of players are going to have quite different initial playthroughs of the game with a whopping 8-ish optional areas. There is something I really like about this a lot, to be honest, and it adds a lot of variety and allows people to be like, oh here, did you see this? And their friends like, oh my god, no way. It also allows for various ways of speedrunning the game. So, Old Yharnam, Hemwick, Upper Cathedral Ward, Yosefka's Clinic, the Healing Church Workshop / Abandoned Church Workshops, basically the same area, Canehurst Castle, Nightmare Frontier, and Yahar Ghul if you get captured by a bagger early on in the game. These are all optional areas that you just don't need to do. Now, where Bloodborne does fail in my opinion is its attempt at a connected world. The game progression does not facilitate the necessity for backtracking and exploration, and yet the game actually has a few links from area to area. However, functionally they don't actually do anything. The game does not ever need you to return to Yharnam, and yet there are a few NPC quests that happen there past the start of the game. Although this is a very minor thing, and overall the level design for Bloodborne is really fucking good, it does have the issue, again, of being able to warp to anywhere you want, except this time you need to go to a hub to warp to a different place for whatever fucking reason. So it's actually the worst in terms of that, especially when Dark Souls 2 let you warp to and from any fucking bonfire. But like I said, the actual design of the levels is pretty well done for the most part. I personally get the feeling that the second half of the development of the game was a little bit rushed. The level design goes from classic Dark Souls formula to Dark Souls 2 mostly linear. In my opinion, Bloodborne is second to Dark Souls in terms of level and world design for the entire series. It really is that great, honestly guys. Go and play Bloodborne, seriously. So now we can move on to Demon Souls and talk about that for a while. Demon Souls is split into like 5 mini zone worlds that you can go in and out of at will, essentially. Each zone is split into like 3 or 4 parts each part consisting of an area and boss. Well, it's more like one area has 4 parts and then the other areas have 2 parts and then like a boss straight after the second one, but I digress. Anyway, because of this, the world design isn't really an issue. Like, each area is its own specific thing, it has its own specific challenges and enemies, and because of this it's a little less relevant to the overall discussion, really. So, like I said, each zone is split into parts, and at the beginning of like part 1 you'll have like a bonfire, so to speak, and once you do part 1 and you kill the boss, you'll get like another bonfire after killing the boss. But it's essentially just like a portal in and out of the world, really. Now, most of the areas have shortcuts that link the start of the area to the boss room, essentially. Now, weirdly enough, the 4th zone of the game just doesn't have this like at all. It's just pretty much just completely linear. But most of the areas do have loops, with some even have like 2 shortcuts or whatever. Demon Souls introduced a lot of the tropes we see in later Souls games. We always get like a castle, medieval city area like the Burg. We always have like a lava, fire-based area. We always have like a swampy, disgusting area. Even Dark Souls 3 takes the whole magical jail thing from Latria, but nothing, again, really is particularly comparable to the 4th area, Shrine of Storms. I don't know what the deal with that is. But overall, the level design of Demon Souls, in my opinion, was improved in pretty much every way in Dark Souls and the later games. But even at that, like, Demon Souls is still great in and of itself. However, right, Demon Souls' atmosphere, I still think, is second to none. It has not been even slightly challenged by any of the other games, and I don't know what it is about Demon Souls. It may be like the whole sort of slightly jankiness of everything, but the music, the unique designs of everything, like, for instance, the designs in Demon Souls are like completely non-derivative. Like, everything in Dark Souls, although the design in a technical sense is better, like, the actual visual design of everything is still derivative of everything in Demon Souls. Demon Souls done all of it better, as far as I'm concerned. I suppose the only issue that I could possibly have with Demon Souls level design is maybe the inconsistency. Now, not all the levels have the looping design, and these levels certainly don't feel quite as satisfying to play as opposed to the ones that do. Such as the Shrine of Storms, which again I'm bringing up, is probably the weakest zone out of the 5, just simply because it's very linear overall. Now, the best designed area that I would say is probably 2-1 in Stonefang Tunnel, being both large and like complex and labyrinthine, and then the level later opens up for further exploration once you've cooled the lava pits. I mean, it's really cool, the whole level is great, I think. Now, not all the Souls areas loop around, sure, but it definitely feels more obvious when it comes to Demon Souls simply because of how isolated each zone is. When you're playing Demon Souls, you go into an area and you have that one part of the overall zone to do, but in Dark Souls that isn't the case. The linear parts of Dark Souls, maybe such as Sense Fortress, which is technically linear, it doesn't feel linear because it is a connecting part of the overall world, and the world in and of itself isn't linear. But when it comes to Demon Souls, pretty much it is linear because you're only dealing with that one particular thing, such as level 1-2 when you're doing the Boletaria bridge thing with the dragon. It just it is linear. Like, you go in at the start and then you just work your way to the end and you do the boss. It doesn't loop around or anything like that, and it's not even particularly long either. Now, this isn't technically bad, it's just it's not as good as I feel like it could be. So I guess that brings me to the end of my video. I mean, hope you enjoyed it and stuff. I guess, in conclusion, I think I presented a decent argument for highlighting just how important world design has been in the Souls games. Dark Souls is without a doubt one of the best designed games in recent years, and overall the level design has been alright, but it still never touched upon the greatness that Dark Souls really got. And I mean, Bloodborne, that's just a cool mix of everything, I suppose. If I had to rank the games in terms of level design, I think I would probably put it as Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, believe me, I think the levels are really well designed for the most part, Bloodborne, Demon Souls, and then Dark Souls 2. Now, in terms of world design, I would rank it as Dark Souls 1, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, and then Demon Souls has to go last because it doesn't actually have like a world, so it's only last by like fucking proxy. But yeah, look, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like I said at the beginning of the video, if you want more of this stuff, tell us, I'll make more, and if it comes to the case, I can probably, you know, there's a lot of what to talk about, there's a lot of games that I kind of want to, you know, pick apart, really explain why certain things are good and bad. I've definitely got ideas for the Star Wars game that came out, and I've definitely got ideas for also Metal Gear Solid 5, not even in terms of the story, like actual problems with the gameplay that I would like to discuss. So if you guys want to hear that, and if you've even made it this far, then please comment, tell us, Tell me if you enjoyed it or not. But yeah, remember, if you made it this far and you're not a subscriber, you should probably subscribe because, you know, maybe make more of them. But yeah, okay, I'm going to leave the video there. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.